Just then, the Taliban soldier came over the hill again, not with a crowd. I thought he must have gone off, saying, quick, we've got a Westerner, we're going to have a stoning in 10 minutes' time. But he came back not with a crowd, but with a woman wearing a burqa. And she marched down to me and turned me round and started frisking me. So I had my back to all the men behind me. And I just thought, oh, thank goodness I'm not going to be killed. Well, not immediately. They think I'm carrying weapons or something. And this is why she's frisking me. And suddenly I just felt so angry that those men behind me had made me feel so scared and terrified that I pulled away from the woman and I swung round to the men. And I picked the hem of my dress from the shalwar kameez and I pulled it up and said, look, I'm not carrying any weapons.
Did they all?
And the men collectively gasped, ah, and slowly turned round and then ran as though the devil was biting their heels. The woman wearing the burqa swung me round and slapped me over the face. She was so shocked at this vulgar display. And of course, as I say, it was a clash of cultures. I was wearing trousers, I wasn't showing anything. I just lifted up the skirt and said, I'm not carrying any weapons.
This is part 2 of my conversation with British author and journalist Yvonne Ridley. In part 1, I talked to Yvonne about her thoughts and experiences on what's going on in Gaza. If you haven't seen this video already, I would highly recommend that you do so after watching this video. In the second part, I speak to Yvonne about her experiences in Afghanistan. Yvonne was in Afghanistan in 2001 before the US-led invasion of that country. Yvonne was captured and kept captive by the Taliban for 11 days. I talked to her about events leading up to that and also the circumstances that she faced during her captivity, as well as the aftermath and how her life changed after she was released. Yvonne eventually went on to study Islam in more detail and converted to Islam. I also spoke to Yvonne about her experiences subsequent to this and how this affected her career as a journalist. I hope you find this conversation as engaging and inspirational as I did. I do want to apologize for the technical glitches in this video. My camera kept turning off during the conversation, but I didn't want to disrupt an incredible flow of information with Yvonne Ridley. The discussion was so engaging that we just decided to power through. So I do apologize, but I hope you'll overlook this in light of the wonderful conversation that we were able to capture. Thank you, and now let's get started. Assalamu alaikum, Yvonne, how are you?
Walaikum salam, I'm fine, thank you for asking.
Lovely to see you again. Yesterday we finished, we were talking about the situation in the Middle East, what's going on in Gaza and the conflict there. Today we wanted to talk about Afghanistan, your experiences there. But before we get into that, what happened this morning in your kitchen?
Oh, right. Well, this is a warning to everyone who is a big fan of juices. I had put in all of my ingredients, bits of carrots and various things, and mixed it up with a teaspoon, left the teaspoon in the juicer, and then got distracted by a few other things. And when I came back, I just put the lid on the juicer, pressed the button, and it made a loud noise, more so than usual. And it was like an explosion. And
God.
I was hit with the contents of the juicer, the teaspoon inside.
Did they give you flashbacks of war zones?
The teaspoon shattered the container, and everything came out, and it was like a murder scene.
Was there juice everywhere?
Yes, ceiling, floors, walls, This should serve as a warning to all juice fans out there. Do not leave the spoon in. I know it sounds like
Yeah, why
common.
don't they put that in as a warning label?
Yes,
Do you know what? Once, if my wife was there, she'd tell you. But once I was so stupid. One of those handheld blenders. I didn't realize it was plugged in. Our blender wasn't working, so I was fiddling with it, and it turned on. And I promise, because my finger was in it, and it turned on, and basically, it was shocking. There was blood splattered everywhere on the ceiling. There was drops of blood, and I didn't make a fuss or anything. But I asked my wife, "Can you please take me to the hospital?" So it was nighttime. She took me to the hospital, and we had to wait in A&E. And there was an Afghani auntie there, and my wife still remembers that she gave a horrible look, as in, "Why was your husband in the kitchen?" So that's all she remembers now. But yeah, that was really, really bad. So also, don't do that. Don't stick your finger in a handheld blender when it's plugged in, everyone. So let's talk about Afghanistan. In 2001, you were in Afghanistan, and just before the war there started, and it was global news everywhere. You got captured by the Taliban, and I'd love to know more about that. But before we get into that, can you tell me a little bit, leading up to that, what areas of journalism were you involved in, and what other assignments had you kind of carried out before you got into Afghanistan?
I was the chief reporter of the Sunday Express, and prior to that, I'd been a royal correspondent, and that's somebody who covers the affairs of the royal family. And goodness me, that was really quite treacherous. I didn't enjoy it very much. It was like covering The Sopranos. It was quite tough. And prior to that, I was an investigative journalist. So I ended up in being sent to not Afghanistan, being sent to Pakistan.
Were you? When was this?
9/11.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that makes sense, because I was wondering, how then did you get involved in the Afghanistan scene, and at that time were you involved in geopolitics and international relations and things?
I've always been fascinated with the Middle East and Asia, the MENA region. And after the events of 9/11, a few of us were convinced, that this has to involve the Middle East. What we didn't realize was that it was actually at that point anyway, it was the actions of Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network. And a lot of your listeners and viewers will be too young to remember what happened in 2001 and 9/11. And, they'll have seen the images, no doubt, of the Twin Towers being hit and imploding and falling. And it was such a shocking day that this is what we saw on TV. Every 15 minutes of every hour, lest we would forget, as if. But it was, our screens were bombarded
You're right,
with it for the next
I think
few
for
weeks.
all of us who were old enough to remember things from that time, I think everyone remembers exactly what they were doing, where they were at the time.
It was one of those moments, yes. And it was like the assassination of JFK, except I think this was bigger. And it's one of the favorite questions asked in a newsroom when people are evaluating news is if the assassination of JFK happened on the day of 9/11 and man landed on the moon, what would you lead with?
Wow.
You know, it was the biggest story, and will come to define the millennium and the start of the new century. It was huge. So as chief reporter, I was sent to Pakistan, a country I'd never been to. I had no sort of cultural insight into Pakistan, and I didn't want to go. I had gone to Heathrow Airport, which was in total chaos.
Were you allowed going into Pakistan? Or was it a team?
Well, in those days, you could fly into Pakistan and get your visa
at the
airport. Now you have to do some ridiculous maths test and prove that you have money in the bank before you can go to Pakistan. It's I did complain, and the embassy at the time told me, well, this is what we have to go through to enter Britain. So surely, you know, we're not asking you to do anything that we're not doing ourselves. And I thought, oh, well, fair enough. And
so what was your brief going into Pakistan, and what were you thinking? Did you have in mind which city you're going to go into and who you're going to be meeting? What was the mindset at the time?
Well, I left for Heathrow Airport certain that I was going to get on a flight to New York. But the impact of 9/11 was to shut down America's airspace in its entirety for nearly a week. It was seismic, you know, the psychological damage that this did to the American people is still there today. They'd never been invaded before, apart from when the British burnt down the White House. But, you know, this felt very much like a war on America, and Americans were in a state of absolute shock. That although their country had gone to war with more than 30 other different nations in the last 50 years, that a war was actually coming onto their doorstep.
It was unimaginable.
So psychologically, it had the same impact as October the 7th had on the Israeli people. They were shell-shocked, and it felt personal to each and every citizen. So, you know, this America was a nation that was in a state of shock. So they had to lash out. Somebody has to pay. And for some bizarre reason, although within a couple of days, people knew that the 19 hijackers were all Arabs, the majority coming from Saudi Arabia, people were mystified as to why George Bush suddenly swung to Afghanistan and said, I want Osama bin Laden. He was the alleged mastermind behind 9/11. And so all this focus of attention swung from New York to Afghanistan. And just to remind people, you know, there wasn't any Taliban on those planes. George Bush said he was going to bomb the country back to the 8th century. It might not have been George Bush, but one of his neocons said that they would bomb Afghanistan unless Osama bin Laden was handed over. And of course, if you understand the relationship in that region between an ordinary Afghan and his guest, you can't just demand that somebody hands over, an individual. And, fast forwarding to the 21st century, when Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated by Israel in Iran, he was in a guest house. He was one of their guests. And of course, Iran will strike back, unfortunately.
So it's history repeating itself.
Quite how, we don't know. But in that region, if you're a guest of somebody, you are very precious.
Some people still don't understand the strong tribal code of Afghanistan. But also at the time, I remember, because I grew up in Pakistan. I was born in England, but I lived in Pakistan for a number of years, and I've always been interested in Afghanistan. I did my master's in Middle East politics, and my dissertation was on the Taliban, actually. And I remember at the time, the Taliban was saying two things. One is that we did not invite Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan. We inherited him. When we took over, he was already there. Secondly, if you want us to hand him over, give us some proof. And no one's willing to give them any proof, and just threats and ultimatums. And so it didn't go anywhere.
I think that the Taliban in the end did more than that. I think that and it was never reported in the mainstream media, but I think that through Mullah Omar, who was the then spiritual leader of the Taliban, I think that they said, we will hand him over to a third country that we both agree with, and just show us some of the evidence first, and then we will hand him over, which isn't an unreasonable request. And if you think about it, if somebody demanded somebody from the West, we would be saying, well, give us the evidence first. It's a terrible crime. Give us the evidence, and then we'll hand him over.
But the mindset was different. It was, what's happened in America is unthinkable, and how dare you ask us for evidence?
Well, somebody had to pay. And, unfortunately, this is the American mantra. If something bad happens to America, somebody has to pay.
Yeah, it's also unfortunate, even today, to this day, Western diplomacy there's not much threats, like what's happened with Ukraine and Russia, how that all started, and it was just threats. And then we went from there to threatening China, sanctions. All diplomacy just revolves around threats and ultimatums. And it's really unfortunate.
Yes, well, it's a lack of understanding, a lack of cultural awareness, and it's something that it was a lesson that I learned very quickly when I was arrested in Afghanistan. And looking back now, I see my presence there. It was a clash of two cultures. They couldn't understand me, and I couldn't understand them. They liked me about as much as I liked them. And it was quite a fraught 11 days. But never once did they harm me. They didn't try any great psychological tricks. They didn't use torture. In fact, as I've said, at that time, the war was starting with America. And of course, America just swept into Afghanistan and seized so many people and then transported them off to Guantanamo Bay. And I often say to people, thank God I was captured by the most evil, brutal regime in the world and not by the Americans.
Wow. So tell me, going into Pakistan at that time, so that was the same trip you went from the UK to Pakistan and then from Pakistan to Afghanistan. Is that right? Or did you go to Pakistan and return to the UK?
I flew into Islamabad. I think it was a Friday. I worked for a Sunday newspaper, so my deadline was the next day. Pakistan was about 5 hours ahead, so any advantages I gained, I still had to file a story by about 7 o'clock at the latest that night. And so I was really under pressure to write something and get a story. And by this time, there were about 3,000 journalists from all sorts of news agencies around the world who were also looking for stories in Pakistan. So it was quite a tough arena. But I didn't speak the language. And I just knew from past experience that if you don't have a fixer to hand straight away, then the best thing to do is to find a taxi driver because they know everything. And so I went through about 3 or 4 taxi drivers, and then I hit on this one called Pasha. And I told him, I'm a journalist, I need this, I need that. And he was a great source of knowledge. He had a great news sense as well. And like all taxi drivers, he had great connections. And if he didn't know something, he would know somebody who did. And I remember, so we sort of got through the first Sunday by the seat of my pants. And then the next week, we knew that the war was going to happen, but we knew it was going to take about 2 or 3 weeks before it happened. So I said to him, I would like to speak to General Muhammad Gul, the former head of the ISI in Pakistan. And I have to say, if I asked to speak to the head of the ISI today, I probably would have been ordered out of the car. But Pasha said, he said, that could be quite difficult. He said although he's retired, he lives in Rawalpindi. And he said, leave it with me. I didn't think anything would happen. And then later that afternoon, he came to see me and he said, my wife's sister's brother's cleaner lives next door to a woman who cleans for the neighbor of General Gul. And there was such a long train of people involved in this. And I just thought, well, this is never going to happen. And I said, well, if you can get him, great. The next morning, he came to the hotel and he said, we're off to Rawalpindi. I said, what for? He said, we're going to see General Gul. And I went, how did you manage that? He said, I told you, my wife's sisters, brothers, and the whole string. And this is how we got to the former head of the ISI. And we got some tremendous interviews over the next couple of weeks. We went to the madrasa where Osama bin Laden was like a chancellor there.
Where was this? Sorry, which city was
And
this?
the head of the
Yeah, is this
madrasa
in
was
Karachi?
Sami al-Haq.
Madrasa Banoria, I think it may
Yes. And so we, we were all over interviewing some incredible people. And this taxi driver just turned out to be the greatest source of knowledge. And some American journalists tried to steal him from me.
Secret.
But when they got in his car, he didn't have air conditioning. And they said, "Where's the aircon?" And he said, "I don't have it." And they said, "Well, we can't travel in this." And so I got him back.
So how did it go with General Hamid Gul? What were your thoughts about the meetings with General Gul?
Well, he explained to me the culture of why you can't just hand over a guest. And because the Taliban were saying, Osama bin Laden, whether we like it or not, is our guest, and we can't just hand him over. So he was explaining to me the Pashtun culture, especially. And he was talking rather. So he was very supportive of the Taliban. He liked them. He said that they were an honourable people. And again, he explained the whole concept of Pashtun culture. And, he's trying to educate this Westerner who had no idea. And so it was a really good interview to get. And I do believe, because I was captured a few days later, I do believe he was able to contact them and say, she came to me as a journalist, and
I was going to ask.
I think
General
that he
Hamid
spoke
Gul
up
is a
for me.
legendary personality. He's passed away. May Allah forgive him. I'm sure people in Pakistan would love to know a bit more about. So when you were speaking with General Hamid Gul, I can imagine he was presenting to you the picture as it is from the point of view of himself, the Taliban, Pakistan. But a lot of that was completely contrary to what the beliefs that the West held. And General Hamid Gul himself, if I remember correctly, was banned from entering UK and other Western countries because of his former involvement in setting up the Taliban movement. Not setting it up, but kind of supporting him as ISI. So coming from the Western culture, knowing what you knew at the time, when you were speaking with him, like, was it making sense what he was saying, or were you thinking, this is ridiculous? What is he on about?
No, he made a lot of sense. He was no great admirer of the Americans, but he was very pragmatic, and he knew that if Pakistan was to navigate its way through the geopolitical situation, then it had to acknowledge the Americans and their point of view. But it was clear that he didn't respect the Americans. He seemed to hold some affection for the Afghans, for the Taliban, and for the Pashtun culture. And he gave me an insight into the dilemma facing General Musharraf, who was due to make a statement on television in a couple of days, because George Bush was putting pressure on everybody.
With us or against us?
He said, you're either with us or you're with terrorists. And he wanted each leader around the world to give their allegiance to America or make their position quite clear. And so I asked him what Musharraf would be doing, and he said he's in a very difficult position because people in Pakistan are very suspicious of all things American. They are losing trust in the Americans. They don't believe it's a good nation. They don't believe it has Pakistan's interests at heart. And he said, however, if Musharraf says that he is not going to support George Bush, that will be as good as declaring war on America. And it would cause enormous problems, obviously, for Pakistan. And then he talked about the Indian influence and the Kashmir situation. And, you know, he gave me a masterclass in Asian politics in the couple of hours that I was sitting there. So, you know, I left General Gul a lot wiser and with more knowledge than when I went in. And a couple of days later, of course, Musharraf made that historic television address.
Where he,
Yes. And he had this slow, agonizing build-up, you know, and all people wanted to know, are we with Bush or not? And he and he went agonizingly, step by step, and you could tell this was a man caught between a rock and a hard place. And it was fascinating, having had that talk with General Gul, to watch Musharraf agonizingly make this address to the nation. And I've often thought about that since, because that was pivotal to what happened subsequently in Pakistan and Afghanistan and the rest of the world. And I said to people, you know, I'm not a big fan of Musharraf, but I can't see what he could have done to other than say, I am standing with the Americans. And looking back now, there was only one thing that I think that he could have done. And that was to say, I can't make this decision alone, and so I'm going to the Pakistan people, and so I'm going to hold a referendum. And that would have been the way forward.
If he held a referendum, it would have been, the referendum would have gone against his decision. He would have then had to stand up against America, and he knew what consequences that would have had then. I'm not saying that would have been the wrong thing, but it would have been taking us into a completely different, very challenging set of, not necessarily the wrong direction, but a very difficult path.
Yeah, it would have delayed the inevitable, but Bush would have gone berserk at that point.
They could have gone into the Afghan operation without Pakistan support, so they would have had to dealt with Pakistan first then. In that situation, maybe, I'm not sure what would have happened.
Absolutely right. You know, Pakistan was pivotal, and you know, America needs Pakistan far more then Pakistan needs America. And Imran Khan realized this.
Actually, Imran
and
Khan
I
and
think
Hamid
that
Gul were quite good
that's
friends.
why
I don't know. Did you get to meet Imran Khan back then at that time, or was he not in the picture much?
No, I hadn't spoken to Imran Khan at that time, and I think that PTI, his political party, wasn't up and running then.
Right.
I might be wrong. But no, there was no reason for me to speak to Imran Khan, although I'm sure Pasha would have found a way had I asked.
So
but,
from there, you decide at that point you were deciding to go into Afghanistan. Did you speak with Hamid Gul about it? Did he help you with the logistics of getting into Afghanistan, or did you manage that some other on your own?
No, I didn't decide on the plan to go into Afghanistan until a week later. But I did say to him that I wanted to go, and he said, well, go to the embassy and ask for a visa. And I did. And they looked at me with incredulity when I asked for a visa. And they said, why do you want to go into Afghanistan? And I said, well, I'd like to get all sides of a story that I'm writing. And anyway, they refused me. They weren't interested.
So what happened next then? How did you then decide to, logistically, how did you prepare to go into Afghanistan?
Well, again, I said to Pasha, we've got to come up with a really big story this weekend. And the only one that I can think of is if I get into Afghanistan, or if I get into a training camp, an Al Qaeda training camp in the mountains in Pakistan. And he said, let me think about it. And off he went. And then the next day he said to me, I can get you into Afghanistan. I have 2 very reliable guides who I trust and I know, and they will see that you get in and out safely. He said, going to the mountains is something different. I don't know these people. I am not entirely certain that I can protect you.
Afghanistan situation was at the time, I think it was a safer decision than going into the mountains in Pakistan at that time.
Well, it turned out to be a very good call, because while I was looking at this, so was another journalist, Daniel Pearl from the Wall Street Journal. And he went into the training camp that I was going to go into. So, yes, it was
so sad, wasn't it?
a good call.
Daniel got killed in,
tragic.
Are you in touch with Pasha?
Absolutely tragic. And, there but for the grace of God. And so, as it turned out, even with hindsight, it was still the best option to go into Afghanistan. And that's something that that weighs heavily on me at times. What if? I mean, we all look back at our lives and say, what if? And I honestly don't think that we would be doing this interview today had I gone for the Kashmiri training camp run by Al Qaeda.
Did you ever subsequently get in touch with Pasha? Did you have his contact details? Oh, wow.
We keep in touch now and again. And
Excellent. Pasha, if you're watching this video, leave a comment.
Well, just, salam alaikum, and thank you for all the work that you did do. And, he's wasted as a taxi driver. He was so knowledgeable, and everything that a journalist could want in a fixer and a guide. He was great. And he also had a tremendous news sense. He came up with the idea that we should go to a place called Dera Adam Keel. And we got there, it was like a one-horse town, and the front street was lined with little engineering workshops, and people were producing Kalashnikovs. And it was this man tried to sell me a Kalashnikov.
Handmade weapons industry in the world to this day. It is amazing the skills they have.
They could make anything. And they had Chinese weapons. They had the Kalashnikovs. This is what I love about Pakistan, is the people there have a real can-do attitude. They can make something, they can mend something, they can copy something. There is nothing that they can't do if they put their mind to it. And with this sort of attitude, Pakistan should be high in the world today as one of the most productive countries.
If they get the right conditions,
unfortunately,
stability and
there's just this brilliant workforce there that has this can-do attitude.
When it will grow exponentially once the timing is right, with conditions, economy, the government, and.
So I was looking at this Kalashnikov, and this man said, "I'll sell it to you for $50." And I said, "All right." And I'm thinking, how can I get this through Heathrow Customs? And Pasha said to me, "Don't buy it." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "After the first 50 bullets, it'll probably break."
He's right.
But what I found out, which was also interesting later, a few weeks down the line, is that as soon as America started its bombing campaign in Afghanistan, as soon as the bombs dropped and exploded, and after everything fell silent, some enterprising Afghanis would go and collect the metal shards from these bombs, take them to this workshop that I'd been to. They would be melted down and repurposed as
absolutely right.
Kalashnikovs to use on the Americans. So actually, the Americans were often
Yvonne,
fighting their own
parallel.
weapons.
I think this is exactly the same kind of thing that's going on in Gaza at the moment.
Yes, well, Gaza is one of, from a recycling and environmentally friendly point of view, Gaza is probably a world leader, because nothing gets wasted. Everything has a value, everything is repurposed and recycled, and we can learn a great deal from these pockets of poverty. And
Gaza apparently by population is one of the most educated places in the world. They have the highest number per capita of graduates anywhere in the world, apparently.
Oh, Gaza. Well, something that you wouldn't dare say on mainstream media. But when it comes to intellect, there's probably no higher intellect in a political group than the Hamas government.
Yeah.
They've all got doctorates. Even I would bet that the leaders in the Al-Qassam brigades have all got doctorates and master's
Yvonne, it's the same
degrees.
with, if we look at
And
the Iranian president now, he's a doctor. I mean, this is the thing. We look down on these nations and think of them as backwards, and but the intellectual talent they have, that's constantly coming up to the surface at the top. And if you compare that to our politicians and what have they achieved other than the politics that they've been involved in? Outside of that ivory tower, they don't necessarily, many times they don't have practical experience, knowledge, which is why there is that disconnect between our politicians and our people.
Well, I think that, I mean, if you look at the first 1,000 years of Islam, if the Nobel prizes for science and maths and physics were available from the inception of Islam, most of the Nobel prizes would have gone to Muslims, because up until the 17th century, they were world leaders in science, in physics, in astrology, in medicine, geometry, trigonometry, all of these mathematical geniuses relied on what the Muslims brought to the table in those early years. It's quite astonishing
Also, Al
and
Azhar University,
incredible.
which was made over 1,000 years ago, one of the first universities in the world. Um, I understand that the first head of that university was actually a female, whereas in Oxford, Cambridge, until even 50 years, 100 years ago, we couldn't have female students entering as a student, Cambridge or Oxford. So there's a lot that we can learn from each other, I think.
Well, absolutely. When it comes to Sharia finance, the Western banks are left behind, but the Arab banks are world leaders, because they employ a lot of women who could run circles around the men in Wall Street and the Square Mile in London when it comes to Sharia compliant finance. It's really fascinating. And I think it was the 1940s before there was a woman appointed as a bank manager. The first
Wow, I can
Western
imagine.
female bank manager. It was, I think, the 1940s or the
No.
1950s, which isn't
So
that
tell
long
me then,
ago.
let's continue into Afghanistan. You must have been terrified, no? Because I was offered to go into Afghanistan, and that's a different story. But I was offered, somehow I had connections with the President Karzai's, and someone offered me to take me into Afghanistan on a helicopter, and I was terrified, and it didn't happen at the end. One of the reasons is my wife is British English, white English person, and she wasn't. She was advised to stay back. And so yeah, so I wasn't allowed to go in as well. But even then I wanted to go, but I was terrified, and this was well after the war. So I can't imagine what was going through your mind at that stage, when you're constantly, you know what the situation is, the political scenario. You have been told certain things about the Taliban, about Afghanistan constantly, and it's a completely alien situation to you. You probably have never been into a country like that ever. What was going through your mind?
Well, I look back now and I think, what on earth were you thinking of doing? I was highly motivated, highly driven, very competitive. I never worked with other journalists in a group to be spoon-fed and all agree on the same story and anything like that. I always worked on my own, and you know, as I say, there were 3,000 journalists from around the world, and I wanted to get something that they couldn't get. So, as I say, I was highly motivated, highly driven, and it was that overcame the fear of what I was doing. It was only when I put on the burqa and we crossed over from no man's land in Pakistan into Afghanistan that I thought, what the hell are you doing? And all I could hear was this boom, boom heartbeat, and it was coming right up into my eardrums. And I was certain that the Taliban checkpoint would hear this boom, boom, boom. But they totally ignored me. I was irrelevant. I was a cross on a piece of paper. And we walked past them and off we went to Jalalabad in one of those, well, it was in a taxi. And it had 2 punctures on the way to Jalalabad. And I just thought, oh gosh, this is a sign that things aren't going to go well. But it was incredible. I mean, wearing the burqa enabled me to walk around the marketplace in Afghanistan without anybody bothering, without anyone looking, without, you know, it was like wearing Harry Potter's magic cape. I was invisible as far as people were concerned. And I was able to observe life in the marketplace. And you can see how poor the country was by the local butcher, you know, with his bits of scraps of meat hanging up. And the atmosphere was one that was very sort of engaged, very bubbling. People were excited, but not excited in a fearful way. All the shopping was being done by the men. The women were either standing there or sitting on the pavement waiting for their husband to finish the shopping. It was really quite incredible. And as I say, you know, from my point of view as a Westerner, I saw all these men doing the shopping, and I just thought, why can't we get the men to do the shopping back home? You know, why is it that we have to go to the shops? And it was just the reverse of what happens in the West. So it was, I wish I could have understood the language, but I couldn't. And the guides told me that people were very upbeat and not fearful at all, even though it was clear George Bush was banging the drum for war.
So then, when you entered Afghanistan, was everything fine until you got captured, or did things start going down a slippery slide? How did that happen then?
Well, after we left the market place, we caught one of those tick-tick or tuk-tuk taxis and jumped on that, and it took us to this area. It was a little village, a tiny village, and when we walked in, everybody was so excited and so happy to see the 2 guides, because one of them was came from that village. So there was much
Did the
joy
people
at
know
seeing
who the
him.
guy is bringing with him? Did they know, were they expecting you or no? Okay.
Not immediately. There was just lots of joy around, and obviously he had bought a lot of goods to give to his family in the village. And then somebody must have said, "Hang on, who's that woman there?" And he then said, "Well, it's a Western journalist, and she's here for a story." And they went crazy. So I was taken into this house and told to sit down. And while they decided what they were going to do about, what the hell have you brought this Western journalist in? Because that morning, Mullah Omar had made a declaration that anyone helping any Westerner in this time of crisis would be executed immediately, because no two ways about it. And so they didn't want me in their village. But well, you'll know this from knowing the area the way you do. The Afghan hospitality is overwhelming, and very soon somebody came in to see me. It was a woman, and she started talking to me, and then the guide was translating for me, and she said, "Do you have any children?" And I said, "Yes, I have a daughter." And she put her hand on her hips and said, "A daughter? What about sons?" And I said, "Only a daughter, one daughter." She said, "You have one child." She said, "Me, I have 14. And when you run out, what was it? I have 14. And she said, you Westerners, all you can ever manage is one or two children. You're so pathetic."
This is
And I'm
such a funny
sitting
story.
there thinking, oh
I've
gosh.
heard you say this
And she
story
said,
back in the, like, when you came out of the capture of the Taliban. And even then, it was hilarious. I was laughing. Basically, was she trying to tell you that, like, we can outman you, or as in we have...
oh yes, because she then went on to say, that she had 14 children, and she
Yeah.
said, and when you run out of your boy soldiers, I will be producing more. And I just thought, oh gosh, and I said, but, aren't you afraid of the Americans coming into your village? And she said, dare one American come into this village, and I myself will attack them with those pots and pans over there. And I just thought, gosh, I thought that Afghan women were supposed to be shy, oppressed, women who didn't speak, and yet this woman was larger than life. And she knew what she had to do if an American soldier came into her village. As it happened, they didn't go into the village. They dropped bombs from B-52 bombers, and so they wouldn't have encountered women like her. But she was astonishing. And then she said, we're really sorry for what happened to the American people, this accident. And she kept referring through the translator to 9/11 as an accident. And I said, hang on. I said, this wasn't an accident. 10,000 people died, which we thought at the time, we were told, the first figure that came out was that 10,000 Americans had died. And she said, 10,000. I said 10,000 have died. And she sort of looked, and I explained about the Twin Towers being hit, people being so afraid that they were jumping out of the 30th story rather than stay inside the building and wait to be rescued. And she just looked really confused at all of this. And then I realized, whereas we had been bombarded every minute of every day with all of these horrific images for 3 weeks, there were no televisions in this village. And all the buildings were single story. In fact, most of Afghanistan, it was single story. And to try and comprehend the Twin Towers was virtually impossible. And she just said, look, we are sorry for what has happened, however big it is. But she said, what has it got to do with us? And I thought to myself, she's got a point. 15 of the hijackers were Saudis. The other 4 came from the Emirates. There were no Afghans on those planes. So, what did it have to do with them, apart from the bin Laden connection? And it was just really very, very strange and sad. And then a young couple came in. They were brother and sister. They were in their late teens, early 20s. And they had been medical students. And the girl said, I should be qualified as a doctor by now to help save my people in a time of war. And I'm rotting away in this village. And I said to her, well, I heard that the Taliban don't want women to be educated. So I guess that's why you're here. And her brother said, no, I was training at the same medical college. And he said, I was sent home too. And it turned out that the college had closed down because it ran out of funds. It ran out of money. And of course, at that time, the Taliban had been isolated by the international community. And that was the negative impact, the unseen impact of isolating Afghanistan, was that this medical school with all these bright young boys and girls in had closed down.
Exactly.
So it was, I started to see a different perspective. And none of the women wore burqas either. And so it was certainly eye-opening.
Tell me what happened then when you did get captured, and where were you taken, and how long were you in captivity for?
Well, it was quite obvious as the day wore on that the Afghan villagers wanted me out. And so we left. But by the time we got back to the border, Musharraf had sealed off the border, so nothing was getting in or out of Afghanistan or into Pakistan. And the guide said, we'll stay overnight because it was starting to get dark. And the next day we'll go over a smuggling route. And I thought, oh, that sounds exciting. And if I do manage to get out, at least I'll be able to put this into the story and add some color about how brave and daring I was going through this smuggling route. And so I was quite happy about that. And the next day we went off on this alternative route. And I thought, so I'm on the smuggling route, yes, and I thought that the area would be deserted and we would be running from tree to tree and ducking and diving, but it wasn't like that at all. It was milling with hundreds of people. Lots of Afghan families going one way with their hand carts and all their worldly goods, dragging them towards Pakistan to escape the bombing that they knew was coming. And from the Pakistan side, there were young men striding over from the border saying, you know, we've come to join the Taliban to fight the great Satan, as they referred to America. So there was lots of comings and goings, people selling coffees and teas. I saw some camels. And by this time, the Afghan shoes I was wearing were beginning to cut into my feet. And I started complaining to the guide, saying I can't go much further. And they said, can you ride a donkey? And they took me over to this string of miserable looking donkeys. And I looked at them and just sort of sneered and said, of course I can ride a donkey. I can ride horses. I can jump. I can race. I said, you know, look at these. Of course I can ride a donkey. Same shape, same size, you know, just we'll get a donkey. So we bought a donkey. I don't know what the deal was because I certainly wasn't going to take it back. But I got on this donkey and I'm adjusting myself in the saddle and the animal just bolted. And it just went herring off at a great rate of knots. And the wind was flapping in the folds of my burqa and they were snapping, and that made the animal run even faster. And I'm trying to lean forward to get hold of the reins to try and pull this beast under control. And as I leant forward, the one piece of equipment that I'd taken into Afghanistan was my camera. And that fell out of the folds of my burqa. And it was right in the view of a passing Taliban soldier. And I don't know how coordinated this was, but the donkey stopped at the feet of the Taliban soldier and threw me off. I don't know if he had grabbed the reins. I just don't know how it happened, but I went up into the air and then tumbled back down. And as I pulled myself up, I'm looking through the grill of the burqa, and this man is shouting at me, and it's obvious he wants the camera. So I took the camera and handed it to him. And then I stood back and closed my eyes because I thought he's going to shoot me now. You know, this is what the most evil, brutal regime in the world will do. And so I had my eyes closed, and I had them closed for about 10 seconds, which is quite a long time when you're waiting to be shot. And when I opened them again, he'd gone. He'd gone over to the donkey trader. He wanted to find who's in charge of this woman. Then he would find out who was responsible for the camera. So I just thought, my goodness, I can get away. He doesn't realize I'm a Westerner. So I looked around, and there was a group came towards me with 3 women wearing burqas. And I thought, I'm just going to join this group. And so I attached myself to the end of this group. And I just thought, what's one more burqa? Nobody's going to take any notice. And so I just joined them. And, you know, they say you should never look back, but I did. And when I looked back, I saw my 2 guides were surrounded by about 30 angry men, all jostling and pushing. And the Taliban soldier was in the middle, and he had the camera in his hand, and he's shouting and he's waving the camera. And I just thought, oh gosh, you know, that they're in serious trouble. And then I reasoned, well, we agreed in the event of anything going pear-shaped, we would go our separate ways, and it would be each man, woman for themselves. And so I just continued walking with this group. And then I looked around again, and by this time, it really, there was a huge crowd gathering around the men, and I just thought, I can't leave them. How can I write my story and say at the end, oh, and by the way, I abandoned my 2 guides. So
you were
cursing
almost out.
myself,
You just kept going.
I turned round. I should have kept going, but anyway, I couldn't, because I realized that if they had seen, if they had developed the camera, they would have seen the pictures, and they would have realized, you know, a lot more than, and so it would have exposed the villagers in this little village called Karma. And so I went back, and I'm cursing myself under my breath, saying, you shouldn't be doing this. And I had 2 voices in my head. Yes, you should. You've got to do the right thing. And another voice saying, no, just turn around and run. You'll get away, and you'll still get your story. And so I'm wrestling with my conscience as I walk towards them. And then I tried to push my way through this crowd, and they just looked and swatted me away. You know, this was man's business, nothing to do with women. So I went back in again to try and get through. And again, I was thrown aside. And by this time, the red mist had descended, and I'd been knocked to the ground. So I jumped up, pulled off my burqa. I was wearing a shalwar kameez. And as I say, I pulled off my burqa, and I said, will somebody let me through? And suddenly everything froze. Everybody stopped. And then they parted, and it was like the parting of the sea. And I walked through straight to the Taliban soldier, who was looking gobsmacked, thinking, where the hell has she come from? What is she in all of this? And I snuck a quick look at my guides, thinking that they would be looking back at me going, oh, how brave, how noble. And I looked at them, and they looked at me as if to say, we were in trouble before, but now we're in serious trouble. And so as I'm walking towards this soldier, I just thought, oh no, this is the worst thing that I could have done.
Oh no.
I would have been better off walking to freedom. So the 3 of us were grabbed, taken into a car, and driven off at speed back towards Jalalabad. And one of the 2 guides who spoke English sort of whispered to me, don't say anything. And I just said, I won't, you know, I don't know you, and we'll keep it going. And at this point, the driver and the soldier were having this heated argument, and they kept looking back at me and shouting at each other. And in the end, the driver did an emergency stop, and the soldier got out and went around to my side, opened the door, and sort of pointed his gun and wanted me out of the car. And I just thought, oh, this is it. I'm going to be shot. So I got out of the car and he pointed for me to stand on this mound. So I stood on this mound, this little hill. And then he went over another hill and disappeared out of sight. And I just thought, what's going on here? And I thought I could make a run for it, but I've never been a sprinter. And I just thought I'd get caught straight away. So I'm standing on this mound and I'm looking round, and the place was absolutely deserted. And as I'm looking around, I'm seeing rocks and stones and pebbles on the ground and my blood red nail varnish shining back at me. And I don't know what had happened, but in this melee, I'd lost my Afghan shoes. And I just thought, oh gosh, nail varnish is banned under the Taliban. And if they see my red nails, they'll chop my toes off one by one. So I'm trying to dig in my feet into the dust to hide this nail varnish. And then I looked up, and from a deserted area, it was suddenly full of people. And I don't know where they came from because they weren't on the horizon. But there was about 30, 40 angry-looking men in front of me. And they were staring at me really angry, and they were coming forward step by step, getting closer and closer. And I just thought, oh gosh, this is the stoning corner. That's what all these rocks and pebbles are doing around here. Any minute now, I'm going to be stoned to death. And I'm looking round for a kind face, somebody who will be my champion and stop the stoning, but they all looked so angry.
Or were they looking at the other people in the taxi?
Then I remembered, as a Sunday school teacher, teaching the children about how Jesus saved a woman and stopped her from being stoned. And he had shouted to the crowd, let him without sin cast the first stone. And I thought, right, this is what I'm going to do. So I thought, I'm just going to shout out, let him without sin cast the first stone.
This is so funny.
Obviously, I wasn't thinking straight because nobody spoke English. And there were three very old, pious-looking men at the back with big, long, white beards. And I looked at them and I just thought, oh, no, I'm not going to say that because they'll say that's us and they'll start the stoning straight away. Just then, the Taliban soldier came over the hill again, not with a crowd. I thought he must have gone off, saying, quick, we've got a Westerner, we're going to have a stoning in 10 minutes' time. But he came back not with a crowd, but with a woman wearing a burqa. And she marched down to me and turned me round and started frisking me. So I had my back to all the men behind me. And I just thought, oh, thank goodness I'm not going to be killed. Well, not immediately. They think I'm carrying weapons or something. And this is why she's frisking me. And suddenly I just felt so angry that those men behind me had made me feel so scared and terrified that I pulled away from the woman and I swung round to the men. And I picked the hem of my dress from the shalwar kameez and I pulled it up and said, look, I'm not carrying any weapons.
Did they all?
And the men collectively gasped, ah, and slowly turned round and then ran as though the devil was biting their heels. The woman wearing the burqa swung me round and slapped me over the face. She was so shocked at this vulgar display. And of course, as I say, it was a clash of cultures. I was wearing trousers, I wasn't showing anything. I just lifted up the skirt and said, I'm not carrying any weapons. And it makes me laugh when I look back now. But, I said when I've met General Gull, I had absolutely no cultural awareness at all of the region. And that was one of the examples.
It's cultural, and
One
also
of the
so
big
much is
faux
getting lost in
pas I made.
translation because all of this is going on playing out in your mind, whereas in their minds it's a completely different.
But I'm going to die. I was convinced I was going to die. I had been captured by the most evil, brutal regime in the world. That's what Tony Blair
It's
and
true. I
George
mean,
Bush called
when
them.
you draw that
And
picture, like when the car stopped and you were in a deserted area, if I was just thinking, if that was me, I'd be thinking, this is where they're going to kill me and bury me. This is like in the middle of nowhere. It sounds really scary, and I don't know how you actually got through it all. You're a courageous person.
well, I think that emotionally I had shut down because, and this does happen. Well, it hasn't happened to me that often, but what does happen when I'm in real danger, I just go very quiet and silent, and so as I'm being driven in this car, I just thought, this is it. I'm going to die. Any minute now, I'm going to die. It's not a matter of if, but when. And as the car stopped at every checkpoint, people surged forward. They all wanted to see the American spy, and they were shouting death to Amrika and Osama Zindabad, and long live Osama and death to the American. And it was, and I wound the window down at one point and said, I am not American, I'm British. And they looked at me as if to say, what difference does that make? And there was this little boy, he must have been about 9 or 10. He rushed up to the car and squashed his face at the window to get a good look at the American spy. And I looked back at him and I winked, and he just looked shocked and just shook his head gravely and went like that. And I thought, yeah, he's right. And so I was driven to the intelligence headquarters in Jalalabad, which, as it turned out, was ex-King Shah's Winter Palace. It wasn't as grand as it sounds. And I was taken to a room and given a pencil and some paper and told to write down who I was, any telephone numbers, any numbers at all, and to prove that I was a journalist. And I handed this paper back. I hung on to the pencil because I thought, I'm back in business again. I can at least write. And I was there for about 6 days.
What did you write on the paper? Did you write
And
like?
during that
Do you
time, I was
remember?
interrogated by some of the scariest looking men with huge, big black turbans and big black beards. And I didn't realize that the piety of a person was attached to the size of their turban. And so these were 6 very pious, stone-faced looking men. And the next 6 days, it was just surreal. It was like being caught up in an Andy Warhol movie.
So you were captured. You kept in that palace, that Winter Palace that you were taken to. Is that where you remained for the next many days?
No, I was there for 6 days. And on the 6th day, somebody came to see me, and the interpreter I had, a young man called Hamid, he said to me, you have a very important visitor and you must be respectful. For the entire 6 days, I'd been the prisoner from hell. I'd spat at them, I'd swore at them. I don't know where I got the guts from to do all of this, but they were appalled at my bad behaviour, and they kept saying to me, "You are our guest. We want you to be happy." I'd gone on hunger strike. That upset them. You'd think that they couldn't care less if I ate or not, but they did. And so on the 6th day, Hamid said, "You have a very important visitor. Please, Madam
He was probably
Ridley,
so scared,
be respectful."
not knowing what you're going to do and what's going to happen.
Well, he said to me one time, "Please, just remember, I am the one who has to deliver your words. These people terrify me and they should terrify
That was wise
you."
words, yeah.
So I said to Hamid, I said, "Well, who's coming in? Is it Osama bin Laden? Is it Mullah Omar?" And he said, "Please, just be respectful." So I'm sitting there and wondering who's going to come through the door. And then there was a knock at the door. So I went up, and although I was the prisoner, I had the key. So I unlocked the door and opened it, and there was this man that made my blood run cold. For 6 days, I'd avoided talking about religion, and there was a Malama in front of me, dressed from head to toe in ivory, and he had this look on his face. I've never seen anything like it before. I'm looking closely at him thinking, is he wearing makeup? Because he had this luminous look on his face, and the light was coming out of him. It wasn't shining on him, it was coming out. And of course, I now know that what he was showing was the Nur. And I have seen the Nur on other people before, but not to this degree and intensity. It was quite incredible. Anyway, so I just thought, oh no, it's the God Squad. I'm in serious trouble now. And so I stepped back, and he walked in and he sat down, and I sat down, and Hamid translated. And he said, "What religion are you?" And I thought, oh, for 6 days I've avoided talking about religion, and now we're right in. And I said, "I'm a Christian." He said, "Yes, but what sort of Christian? Are you a Roman Catholic? Are you a Protestant?" I said, "I'm a Protestant from the Church of England." And he said, "And what do you think of Islam?" And I just thought, oh, gosh, I've got to be very careful what I say. So I just sat there and I said, "Oh, it's wonderful." And I went off in praise of this religion that I knew nothing about. And after I'd run out of adjectives of praise, he then said, "Yes, Islam is beautiful." And there was this silence which I felt I had to fill. So I jumped back in again saying, "Yes, it is beautiful. It's peaceful." And I said, "And the people around here, they love their faith so much." I said, "Do you know, they pray 5 times a day." And I didn't realize that the 5 prayers were obligatory. And he looked and he smiled at me, and instead of saying, "You stupid woman," he looked at me and said, "So, you would like to convert?" And I sprang back and I
didn't
thought,
see that coming.
damn, he caught me. If I say yes, I'll sign up to your moon god religion. He'll say, "You insincere, fickle woman, take her away and have her stoned." Or if I say, no, I'm not interested, he'll be furious and it'll be an insult to Islam, take her away and have her stoned. So I'm sitting there thinking, what am I going to say? And then a light bulb went off. And I said, I can't make such a life-changing decision while I'm in prison. But if you let me go, I promise, when I get back to London, I will read your Quran, your holy book, and I will study Islam. And he said nothing more, and he just stood up and
answer.
walked out.
Yvonne, do you know who this man was? Did you ever find out?
I have. In my last trip to Afghanistan, the intelligence minister granted me an audience with him. And I said to him, the one piece of the jigsaw of what happened, I said, I haven't been able to fill. And I want to know who was the man who invited me to embrace Islam. And he spoke to a few of his people, and then he gave me a name, and he said, I said, oh, I'd love to meet him. And he said he died 2 years ago in an operation against the US. And
he's shaheed.
I was very upset to hear this news. And he said, but he knew that you'd converted and that he was, very happy that you have embraced Islam. I've got it written down.
Text me it later.
I don't have it to
really
hand.
Interested to know.
Yes. Well, what I'm wanting to do now is get a few people together and raise money for his village. It's a very poor village, and it doesn't have a mosque.
Tell me when you start that. I would love
to want to build
help in whatever way I can.
Great. Well, I'll keep in touch with you about that.
So now let me just take a second to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode today has kindly been sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a London-based Amazon consultancy agency. They specialize in everything to do with sales on Amazon. So that includes everything from product research, supplier sourcing, keyword research, listing creation, image editing, video editing, advertising management, inventory management, shipping, logistics, and warehousing. So if you're currently thinking of starting your own Amazon brand, or even if you're an existing brand wanting to broaden your horizons and either go into new marketplaces or other platforms, then do get in touch. WLC is just what you need. WLC also is an Amazon partner agency. Amazon has recently started a program whereby they can partner with select agencies to provide extra support to qualifying sellers absolutely free of cost. So if this is something that interests you, then do get in touch and let's see how we can help you. I say we because I happen to be the founder and the CEO of the Worldwide Listings Company. As my appreciation to you for being an early supporter of our podcast, I would like to take this opportunity to offer you a special deal today. Get in touch through the links in the description and quote Kianistan when you speak to someone. If you're a new seller, we can provide you free consultancy, and if you're an existing seller, we can provide you a free complete audit and analysis of your account and a strategy that you can implement to further enhance and improve your account. Not only this, we can also offer you 1 month complete free Amazon account management services. This is a great deal, and it'll offer you hundreds of pounds worth of savings that you can use either on your ads or your inventory. So you have absolutely nothing to lose. There's no contracts to sign, and you can walk away anytime you like, along with the audit and strategy we provide you with. And if you like, you can implement that yourself or use it as a yardstick to measure the performance of your management team. I thank you again for supporting Kianistan, and now let's get back to the episode. So at that time when you were moved, we were kept in that location for 6 days, and then where did they move you from there? And in that time, did you have any contact with the outside world through the diplomatic channels or anything like that?
After the meeting with the Milana, Hamid came back into the cell about 15 minutes later, and he said, you're going home on a Red Crescent plane. Well, I punched the air thinking how clever I had been in being able to talk myself out of getting killed, and that this Milana was going to let me go. And so I ended up on a truck heading to Kabul, and we drove past the airport. I couldn't see any Red Crescent plane there at all. And then we drove into a prison, a really grim third world prison. Oh. And I was taken down a corridor, and I just thought, oh gosh, this is death row. And they opened a door and they said, go in. And I said, I'm not going in there. Put me in a hotel. And they looked and said, you are a bad woman. You came to our country without a passport, without visa. You have to be punished. And I said, I'm not going into that cell. And
oh my God, did they say you have to be punished? So you, at that stage, you knew?
No, they said you have to be punished, you know.
Oh my God. I would have died at that point, I think.
Well, I just threw every bad word that I could think of at them. And then another cell door opened, and five or six women came out, and they were all wearing hijabs. And one of them said in an Australian accent, are you from the Red Cross? And I looked at her and I said, no, I'm not. And I said, your accent. I said, you speak English? She said, well, I'm Australian. These three are German and these two are American. And I went, oh my goodness, you're the missionaries who've been arrested and accused of trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. And they said, yes, well, it wasn't true, but yes, we are.
Oh, so it was them.
And I just thought, so journalist hat comes on, and I'm thinking, I need to get an interview.
You're professional too.
And I said to them, look, will you tell these guys I am not going into that cell? It's disgusting. I wouldn't put an animal in there. And so they spoke the language, and they were communicating with these Taliban. And then Deanna, the Australian girl, said, well, you can come into our cell for tonight and we can try and sort this out in the morning. So I said, right, okay. Because I just thought, at least I'm with these women, and I don't know if I'll get to print it or not, but at least I'll get the last interview with them. So I went into the cell and spent the next 4 or 5 days with the...
Yvonne, I'm just thinking, if that was me, I'd be thinking, at least I have someone from a Western person who can speak English and give me comfort. And there you are thinking, at least I can get an interview. You're amazing, actually.
Well, I learned a lot about the reality of being in prison under the Taliban through these women. And it was quite obvious that I was going nowhere. So I was there for another 4 or 5 days. The war started. That was terrifying, being bombed by your own country. And, you can hear a cruise missile from 20 miles away. These were coming within half a mile of the prison, and the place was shaking. And I just thought, this is it. I'm going to be killed.
Well, so the war had started at that point?
Yes. The night of October the 7th. Okay. I remember it very well because I continued to keep up the prisoner from hell business. And so they separated me from the Christians, and they put me in a room upstairs in the prison. And it turned out to be one of the commander's rooms, but I had the key and again. And, I was still on hunger strike, but I was a smoker, a very, very heavy smoker. And despite this, the Taliban gave me 200 cigarettes, which I thought was quite nice of them. Not the brand that I normally smoke, but any port in a storm. And I remember going into this room in the Taliban sort of barracks above the prison, and sitting there, and I got out my cigarettes and I opened my matchbox. There was one match left, and I just thought, oh gosh, I really need to smoke. I'm just going to have to chain smoke to keep it all going. So, so I was sitting in this room, chain smoking, and I was onto my third or fourth cigarette when suddenly there was just like this huge loud noise. It wasn't a boom, it was more like a crack. It just, and the sky just went black and white, and I realized, this is the start of the war, and that it was quite terrifying. And then the door burst open, which was unusual because although I had the key, it was open. Normally people would knock first, but the door just burst open, and about half a dozen Taliban soldiers piled in and pulled this great big trunk from underneath the bed where I'd been sitting, smoking one cigarette after another. And they opened it, and it was full of explosives. I thought, my goodness, one careless cigarette could have started the whole war and they just took these RPGs, these rocket-propelled grenade launchers, from out of this case, and off they went. And after the war, after the bombing stopped, I just thought, if I get out of here alive, I'm joining the anti-war movement straight away, because nobody should have to face that. How on earth can you achieve peace through bombs? And it was like a Damascene conversion. Overnight, I just realized the futility of war and how it achieves nothing but terror. So I just thought, yeah, if I ever get out of here alive, that's what I'm going to do. And then I just thought, if I were the Afghan people, I would march over to the prison and demand that they hand over the Westerners, and they'll rip us to shreds one by one. And so again, I was quite fearful. But the next day, there was a knock on the door, and it was the foreign minister, Mr. McWattle. And he said, Madam Ridley, will you open the door? And I said, no. He said, we're going to take you back. We're returning you to your country. And I said, I'm not opening the door. You've lied in the past, and you can go to hell. And he said, if you don't open the door, we'll have to break it down. And I just thought, oh. So I opened the door, and he said, I'm sorry no one came to see you last night. You must have been scared. And I said, scared? Scared of what? He said, the war has started. surely, you saw the bombs last night. And I said, oh, I saw a few fireworks. I thought you were just celebrating my release. And he started laughing, and then he said, Ridley, you are a man, which I think was meant as a compliment. And he, took me out. I was put into a people carrier and driven off back down to the Pakistan border, where we waited for about 2 hours. And it was getting quite dangerous because people were saying, who's in that people carrier? Why is it being guarded so heavily?
Yeah.
And there'd already been a riot on the border, and they just wanted to get me over because they thought that if people realize that I'm going to be released, they'll be furious. So the reason for the delay was that Mullah Omar had sent a fax message. I wished I'd kept it, saying that I was to be released on humanitarian grounds, but only to be released to the British representatives. Well, the Brits didn't turn up for me. They were supposed to come in a helicopter into Torkham, and I would then be handed over and taken away, probably off to Islamabad. But they didn't turn up.
And did you find out why they didn't turn up?
They said later, a couple of people from the embassy said it was too dangerous. And
charming.
Well, but I'm glad they didn't, in a way, because if they were in danger, I wouldn't want anybody's life on my hands.
So, do you know why they released you at the end?
Yes, and I found this out since subsequent returns to Afghanistan. They were handed a file, a secret file on me, which made me out to be a spy. And this file showed my bank account details with regular payments from a dubious government source. And it showed that I had an ID card from the intelligence services. It showed a photograph of me and an ex-husband, and the ex-husband, he had a Mossad card as well, and there was this whole story built around me as some sort of super spy. And I said to the head of intelligence when I returned to Afghanistan, I said, what made you realize that I was a journalist? And he said, well, it was your two guides.
Oh, wow.
He said, if you were from the intelligence services, you would have gone in with people who had a history or a connection with intelligence services.
So who prepared all those false reports on you then?
Well, you can make up your own mind. But I thought it was British intelligence at first. And I had a contact in MI5, and I went to his office after I was released, and about a week later I went to see him, and I said, what the hell were you trying to do by getting me killed? I know all about this intelligence file. And he just said, it wasn't us. And then he opened his drawer and pulled out a photograph, and he said, it was as though he was expecting me. And he said, if we had wanted you dead, we just needed to send them that photograph. And he threw a photograph at me. And what a lot of people didn't know is that for some years I had been in the Territorial Army, which is like a volunteer force, a reserve force. And I worked in the press office for the British Army. And this photograph that he had, that he threw over to me, showed me in army combats with a gun in my hand.
Wow.
And
yeah,
and he
right.
said, we wouldn't have done anything as elaborate as that. And I said, well, who's done it? And he said, well, it's the clumsy work either of the CIA or Mossad. And so I just I just left it at that. And I just thought to myself, well, what possible benefit could they get out of having me executed? And he said that it would have kick-started the war. He said, you had become front page news on every newspaper around the world. And because your mother was constantly broadcasting to the media, it was as though people knew you and had formed a little bit of an attachment. And he said, if you had come back in a body bag or been executed on video, he said that would have been the trigger that we needed to start the war.
Wow.
So
it's such a murky world, isn't it?
It is. I've not really gone in depth into this before because I just thought if I investigate this as it should be investigated, then I'm going to end up crazy. So I just left it.
I think you're right. Also, I'm just thinking from the Taliban point of view, I'm actually surprised that they released you, because regardless of whether you're a journalist or you're a spy or whatever you are, you're a Western person in their captivity. You're about to be attacked by the West. If nothing else, they can use you as a bargaining chip, as a human shield, something or the other. But while the bombing has started,
well, I've thought about this as well, and as I say, subsequently I've been back and I've met those who detained me, those who questioned me, and they said that they realised that Britain, America wanted them to think that I was a spy. What would they do with spies? They would execute them. And they just realised we're being used here. You know, she's an awful woman. She's more trouble than she's worth. We don't want her. They don't want her. Let's send her back on humanitarian ground.
I think that was so wise.
Well, it was. They are wise, and they saw through this crude attempt to portray me as a spy.
What happened with those the Christian ladies?
Well, they as well. It was no big deal losing me because they had the Americans, the Australian, and the three Germans. So when the Taliban fell, they took the girls and they put them. I think they got down to Gardez. And the warlord in Gardez had them locked up in a prison, and they began to see which way the war was going. So they decided we're going to release the prisoners, because I met up with Deanne, the Australian, afterwards.
Oh, okay.
And she said, you know, it was obvious the war was going on. We'd been held in different places, and then we were in this prison in Gardes, and she said the door flung open and this man walked in and said, Azadi, which means freedom, you're free to go. And she said, you know, we all looked at each other and said, well, where are we going to go? Who's going to help us? Where? And so they were given access to a phone, and they phoned their various embassies, I guess. And in the end, Deanne said, we were liaising with the American military and gave them a point of reference on a map of exactly where we would be. And they said, we will come and pick you up at whatever 100 hours it was. And she said, we were standing there waiting, and then we heard a helicopter. It was, I think, a Chinook approaching. And she said they were circling around the wrong area. And she said, you know, this is American Special Forces, and they couldn't even read a map. So in the end, the women had to take off their burqas, put their burqas together and make a bonfire. Oh. And eventually the Americans found them, picked them up, and took them off to safety.
See, even that is just, I mean, I don't doubt any of it, but it's just so unbelievable, isn't it? Because in the middle of the war, they see a Chinook helicopter coming down that they could have attacked, but they just allowed them to take these women away. It is unbelievable. I think it's, I know in the West, a lot of people don't like any nice words spoken about these people, but it does talk about their morality, really.
Well, like me, you know, once they gave their interview, they just sort of disappeared again, because they didn't have anything bad to say about their captors. You know, they weren't harmed. They were their prisoners, but yes, it was really strange. I did return with the BBC in the February, and the guide that I had said, do you want to go to bin Laden's old house in Kabul? And I went, oh, wow, yeah, great. Let's do that. So we went there, and then I noticed that the charity that the women were working for was next door to bin Laden's house. So I rang up one of the German girls and I said, Katia, did you know who your neighbor was when you were in Kabul? And she said, no, we never really got on speaking terms. She said that sometimes there would be a lot of Arab visitors and they would spit at us when we walked past. And I said, oh, well, that's not nice. And I said, well, your next door neighbor was bin Laden. I said, so, and they wanted to return, these girls. So I said, when you return to Afghanistan, don't open an office next to the hornet's nest. They had no idea that bin Laden was their neighbor.
Wow.
And so I think that that's possibly why they had been arrested.
I remember when you were released, and I remember the news at the time, and I remember how everyone was prepared that you're going to come out and you're going to explain how horrible the Taliban were and how they're animals and barbaric. And when you came out, I think it was like everyone kind of felt let down that you just came out, and then the news that came out was that you were treated well. And then there was all this talk about like Stockholm syndrome and all of these other things to explain it away.
Well, Stockholm syndrome, and there's a great doubt now whether it actually exists or not, but Stockholm syndrome is when you are supposed to bond with your captors. Well, there was certainly no bonding. I was the prisoner from hell. When I was released, the Taliban ambassador, Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, gave a press conference and he said, "We are releasing the English woman on humanitarian grounds. She is a very bad woman with a very bad mouth." And so that tells you what they thought of me. Right up until the point of me leaving, I didn't trust them at all. I was still waiting for this brutal, evil regime to surface. And when they told me I was free to go, I got out of the people carrier and I walked backwards because I didn't trust them at all. I thought, if I turn my back, they're going to shoot me. And so I walked backwards out of the people carrier, which will be on film. And then when I turned round, the first people who greeted me was the Pakistan media. And they said, "How did the Taliban treat you?" And as I walked towards them, I thought about everything that had happened in those 11 days, sort of flashed quickly through. And I said, they treated me with courtesy and respect. And the Taliban must have fallen off their chair because, as I say, I was the prisoner from hell. I told them that they were all going to be exposed. They were all going to be charged for war crimes, that they should read the Nuremberg trials and realize what they were in for. And so when I said they treated me with courtesy and respect, they must have thought, what has happened to her?
Wow. And I think that talk tells a lot about your sense of fairness. And I'm sure they secretly must have been pleased. So how was, once you got back to England, and how was life immediately after all of this? Were you in like some kind, did you need therapy? What happened?
Well, I was given 2 weeks off to recover, and anything that I wanted. Oh, but before that, I had to write my story for the Sunday Express, and so after being locked up in Afghanistan, I was then taken to a hotel and basically locked up for 3 or 4 days. My phone was taken away. I just had to write the story for Express newspapers. And they syndicated the story to about 30 different countries. And I think the whole thing made about £2 million for Richard Desmond, the publisher of Express newspapers.
Is that how the contract works? When you returned, you couldn't decide that you're going to, do your own contract now with whatever news source and do your own stories independently and get paid for it? Or is that not how it works? Because you went in from a certain news agency, all the stories belong to them. Is that how it works?
Well, as far as I was concerned, I was employed by Express newspapers. And so, I was still being paid by Express newspapers while I was locked up. And they had sent emissaries to the Taliban to try and negotiate for my release. And in fact, there's a lovely story where the right-hand man of Richard Desmond was sent to Islamabad to negotiate with the Taliban, and he went along with a lawyer of Pakistan heritage. Mm-hmm. And he was told by Richard Desmond, 1 million, 2 million, just whatever it takes, just bring her back. Mm. And after the first meeting with the Taliban, he called Richard Desmond and he said, there's no point in getting out the checkbook. And he said, oh, goodness me. He said, how much do they want? He said, well, it's not a question of money. He said, well, what is it a question of? Do they want medicine? Do they want humanitarian aid? What is it that they want? And he said, they just want to be treated with respect. And Richard Desmond, of course, is a very tough-nosed businessman where everything has a price and there's a price for everything. And the price was respect. He said, well, I heard these people were sick, but I just didn't realize how bad they were. So, but they did a brilliant job in helping me. And the people who weren't helpful at all were the people in the British Embassy. So that, you can, well, it was disappointing. They wanted things like, can you give us the name of a good lawyer? And the embassy said here's a list, there's 12 names on the list. And it was, well, can you tell us which ones are bilingual? And they just weren't helpful at all.
Oh, no. So once you were back and you had time to settle in, was it life as usual? Did you get back into the work routine and everything? And did you forget about try and move on with your life, or did you take a break and kind of how did you decide that you're going to now continue life?
I did a lot of interviews over the next 2 weeks, a lot of photo shoots. I just decided that, I will either speak to everyone or speak to no one. Mm. And then I just thought, it's hypocritical of me to speak to no one as a journalist. There's nothing worse than wanting to do an interview and somebody says no. So I did every interview that was asked, apart from one which was a Belgium glossy magazine which wanted to do a naked film shoot. I just thought, no, that's something that I can do without. So I was really, really busy. And then I was asked to speak at the anti-war rallies, and this was obviously annoying the establishment because I was saying things about Afghans that humanized them, and you can't drop bombs on nice people. So that's when I began to feel the force of what happens when you take on the establishment. Suddenly, I was stopped being interviewed. I was stopped asking to write articles, and my reputation was being diminished by the day, and I then became a source of ridicule, and it was, step by step.
I think if you came out with the stories that they wanted and you
Oh,
told them how bad Taliban, you probably could have got a Nobel Peace Prize by now.
well, I would be a very rich woman by now and probably be working as a columnist for the Telegraph or one of the major titles. And I wasn't. I was, as I say, diminished and ridiculed. But I left the Express newspapers, but remained on a 2-year contract with them, which worked very well for both of us. And during that time, I picked up another story. It was when the drums of war were beating for Iraq.
Yeah.
And I'd just come back from Iraq and Palestine, and I gave a talk at I think it was Bristol University, and I still had the dust of the Jenin refugee camp on my boots, where there'd been a massacre in 2001, and after I'd finished at Bristol University, I went to the bathroom and I was just washing my hands, and this woman appeared and said that she worked for GCHQ, and that she said that there was a very strong feeling against the Iraq war among GCHQ workers, and she said, I think I can get you some interesting documents. And I thought, this is a setup. So
Sounds like it.
I said to her that I gave her the name of Isabel, and I said to her that if she wanted to contact me, let's meet up in London, and just ring up and say it's Isabel. And that's exactly what happened. And she handed over a document to me from the NSA intelligence agency in America. And it was an instruction ordering British intelligence to spy on the United Nations Security Council and to to basically tap their phones, breach their security and find out which way that they were going to vote if there was going to be a vote on the war in Iraq. And this was really a big story. And by this time, my contract had finished with the Express. All the newspapers, with the exception of the Daily Mirror, were pro-war. So I knew that I couldn't get the story printed in any of those newspapers. And by this time, I was, as I say, my reputation was being trashed. So I just thought, this story must be told. And so I contacted the Daily Mirror, but the defence correspondent couldn't stand it up at the time. What I should have done, I should have just gone straight to Piers Morgan, who was the editor, but I didn't. And then I contacted somebody in the Observer who took the story. And I said, don't mention my name at all because it will just distract from this story. And the story, of course, was that US intelligence was ordering British intelligence to break the law by spying on members of the United Nations Security Council. And this must have been signed off by Bush, Blair, the whole entourage.
The highest level, yeah.
And it was really serious, and I didn't want the story being devalued or diluted because of me. Now, then I told you why I went into Afghanistan, because I wanted that byline for a story. But this was a big sacrifice for me. To distance myself from the story. Anyway, the reporter involved, when he was asked, who is your source, he said straight away, Yvonne Ridley. And that was just drew a whole lot of ridicule from people who did not want the story printed. And the editor, Roger Alton, came under tremendous pressure not to print the story. And for 3 weeks, he dilly-dallied around with this story. And by the time it was printed, it was too late. And there was a movie made about it starring Keira Knightley. And it was called Official Secrets.
Really? I was just thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking someone should make a movie on this whole thing because this, I'll watch it.
And there was a lot that was factually incorrect in that film, which was a shame because the intention behind the film was very good, but it let a lot of people off the hook. And
did they consult you through making the movie at any stage?
Sorry?
Did they consult with you at any stage? What?
They didn't consult with me. Otherwise, I would have been able to correct a lot of the things that they had. I think that they were. One of the contacts was annoyed because I wouldn't hand over Isabel, who still to this day enjoys anonymity because
I think that's really amazing because that probably would have ruined her.
When I promised as a journalist not to reveal my sources, that's what I do. And I feel in some ways that's what the journalist at the Observer should have done when I asked him not to reveal that I was behind the story.
Yeah. So, the Iraq War was such a huge disappointment, which is an understatement. And the anti-war movement at that time was so huge. So that's a whole kind of another story as well. But how did then, can we talk about your conversion to Islam? How did you start learning about Islam and what emotions and what learning did you go through?
Well, I kept my word. I started reading the Quran. But I did it more as an educational exercise because I realized that Islam is a way of life. It's not just a religion. And if I didn't know about Islam, then I couldn't report with any authority on what was happening in the Middle East and Asia. And this was highlighted when two Sun journalists got into Afghanistan to investigate allegations that the Taliban had accused Britain and America of bombing hospitals, which they denied. And the two Sun journalists said, we got to the town where they said this happened, and we went to the town's mortuary, and all the bodies had gone. They'd all been buried. So, and it just put a huge question mark. And I thought, yes, all the bodies had gone because Muslims
bury them straight away.
Are expected to bury the dead within 24 hours.
Yeah.
And you got there 48 hours after the crime. And it's just basic knowledge like that I realized I needed to learn more about Islam so that I wouldn't make these ridiculous errors, you know, like saying they pray 5 times a day. How amazing is that? So the educational journey very quickly turned into a spiritual journey for me, because I have always held this core belief in God. You know, I was a practicing Christian. I sang in the choir. I pulled the bells. I was a Sunday school teacher. And so the transition from Christianity to Islam was not that difficult for me, because the roots of Christianity and the roots of Islam and the roots of Judaism are all in the same soil. So it was very easy for me to make that move. And after 2 years, I decided that I was going to become a Muslim.
So in that time, were you studying on your own? Did you have like doubts? If you had any questions, did you have someone that you could go and speak with?
I was so blessed. I had access to some of the finest scholars in the world, who helped me. And what I did, as soon as I had an issue, I would ring 4 or 5 of them who would be at various points on the scale of considered moderate through to extreme. Yeah. And I would get their answers. And then
that is such a blessing. That is a huge resource to have.
You know, I was really blessed. Sadly, some of them are in prison in Saudi now, which is a nonsense. Wow. You know, they're political prisoners in that regime, and some have since died. But yes, I was really blessed with the advice that I was given, because there were things that to me didn't make sense. There was one hadith which said that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said he'd looked into the hellfire and it was full of women. And I just thought, would he really have said that? You know, what was the context? What were the circumstances? And through gaining access to these great minds, I was able to establish that the household of Muhammad, peace be upon him, was extremely lively, a bit chaotic. He had all these wives that he had accrued through political alliance or through charity. And there was obviously, it was a lively household. And the women would argue now and again. And it was put to me that on this particular day, he'd gone in and as we do in all of our homes, you can walk into the middle of a family row and there's all hell going on.
Yes.
And apparently it was this backdrop that he had said, I looked into the hellfire and it was full of women, as if to say, calm down. And then, of course, nobody is in the hellfire at the moment because there has been no day of judgment. So the Prophet also, peace be upon him, had a sense of humour. And this is his humour coming out. He's joshing with his wives. But unfortunately, some have just taken it and taken his words literally without finding out the context, the background, the scenario. And unfortunately, Islam does get misinterpreted.
Yeah. So as you were learning, did your friends and family know that you were going through this journey, and what were their thoughts?
Well, my mum and late father were delighted that I stopped smoking, stopped drinking, stopped clubbing, and became more focused. And they were so happy until I put on a hijab. And it was like, oh, an extremist, what have you done this for? And one of my sisters doesn't speak to me, but that's quite a complex situation. And the other sister is very supportive. My daughter is very supportive. I couldn't get her interested in Islam. And that's a big source of disappointment to me. But, she's a good girl and she leads, I would say, almost an Islamic existence. She's she's not a vegan or a vegetarian, but she's fish only, and she doesn't consume lots of alcohol. She doesn't smoke or take drugs, and she dresses modestly. And so,
inshallah, one day she might be interested in learning a bit more.
One day. But at the moment, I can't get her interested. And I keep telling people, there's some brilliant converts to Islam out there, like Sheikh Yusuf Estes, who can walk into a room and 12 people will suddenly start wanting to take the Shahada. I'm not that convert. I don't have that ability, I think, to bring people to Islam. I wish I did. But so, yes, 2 years after I started studying, I embraced Islam, and the next day I moved to Qatar and worked for Al Jazeera. So it was wonderful waking up in a Muslim country the day after I converted.
Wow. How long did you stay there?
I was there for about 6 months, and then when I came back to the UK, I helped set up Press TV and the Islam channel, and did quite a bit with TV. But my relationship with the mainstream media more or less finished.
That's what I was going to ask, because it must have been awful. Like, so you, people you've worked with for years, all of a sudden you have a completely different relationship. I saw one of your interviews, I think recently on Talk TV, and just the aggressive nature of how they wouldn't let you finish your sentences. And so I was thinking that must be like a constant thing. So how do you deal with that?
Well, there were a few periods of silence during that interview because I just found it difficult to get a point through and to realize what the mainstream media thinks about Gaza, thinks about Palestinians, and it was very difficult.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've changed, but I think my colleagues in Fleet Street have. You know,
Yeah.
it's become almost normalized to slag off Muslims, to demonize Muslims, Islamophobia, racism. You know, it's rife,
Yeah.
and I know these people, and I know that they're not like that, but they are coming out with the most hateful things.
That's what also I was wondering. I wonder if when we see these people on TV with such an aggressive kind of an attitude towards what's going on, towards Muslims, towards Palestinians, is that actually them, or is that how they expected to behave to further their careers, and they're kind of just going along with that? Do they have like one frame of mind when they're presenting all of these things on TV, and are they different off camera? Is so strange. How can you? Is that how they live? Like thinking all of these things?
Well, I just think that this is, it's become normalized and accepted behavior.
Yeah.
And don't, I just don't recognize some of the people that I once knew and some of the opinions that they're coming out with. And when you do
Yeah.
get a chance to talk to them, uh, you can see doubt coming into their mind. And it's really, it's sad.
Yeah. I've heard there's lots of very influential people in the UK, even in the Parliament, in the House of Lords, who have secretly actually converted to Islam, but they just don't want to come out and talk about these things because of the blowback. Is this something that you recognize?
I was told a while ago that there are a lot of Fleet Street journalists who have converted to Islam, but they do not broadcast it. And because of the attitudes that you've been talking about, the aggressive hostility towards
Yeah.
Muslims. And, you know, once you stick your head up above the parapet and dare
Yeah.
say Allahu Akbar, that's it, you know.
As you know, exactly.
So yes, it's
So inshallah, it should give us hope that even though on the surface we might see one thing, but under the surface there are people, wise people with sympathetic views.
yes. I mean, it's, you know, God give them the strength to eventually stand up
Yeah.
and put themselves in the line of fire. It's not a
Yeah.
comfortable place to be,
It's not.
and it's very uncomfortable. And you know, I've made friends with a lot of people over the years, and I think that I'm a good judge of character, and I consider them to be my friends. And when they hold some of these really racist views, I have to challenge them. And apparently, I make people feel uncomfortable because of my conversion to Islam, because I'm not their stereotype of the oppressed, silent Muslim woman.
Yeah, I think this is the thing. People start feeling awkward because it makes them reflect on their own lives. Like my wife is a convert, and I always kind of, every time we see like her friends who are non-Muslims or family members, it's amazing how we never bring up the topic of Islam. It's always them. Like I have had her family members come to me and explain why they don't go to the church that often and why they should. And I'm thinking, I didn't ask you that. I'm not judging you on that. It's completely your own thing. But they see us and then they start reflecting on their own lives, and it makes them question some of the things that they're doing, and they don't like that naturally. So I think that's why we make them feel uncomfortable.
Yes, yes, it probably is. I mean, this is supposedly a Christian country, and when you ask people what is your faith? I'm a Christian. When was the last time you were in church?
Yeah.
Well, it's not that important. It's and then it's they are afraid of Muslims because we pray 5 times a day. The funny thing
Yeah.
is, the more I was looking into Islam, the more I was unearthing about Christianity. And in the very early days, Christians used to pray 7 times a day.
Yes.
So um, I think
This is the thing.
that we make people feel uncomfortable because they know in their heart of hearts they should be doing a lot more for their
Yeah.
faith.
Yeah. And people don't like to be reminded that they need to change. Um, Sister Yvonne, this has been a, amazing for me. I've looked up to you and followed your career for over 20 years now. So, first of all, just for you to agree to show up on this podcast was like a huge honor for me. I can't thank you enough. And all of the things that we've talked about is probably going to be something that I'm going to be mulling over for years to come. And I hope it's the same for our audience as well. And I'm sure it will be. Are there any thoughts that you want to closing thoughts, or any advice for young Muslims or non-Muslims who might be listening?
Well, to non-Muslims, I would just say don't be afraid of Islam. Islam is about what you can do, not what you can't. And to Muslims out there, I feel as though my journey has been more like a pendulum swinging. And I've gone from, music is haram to, oh, well, that voice is God given. Well, and I'm swinging. And now I'm becoming less one way and less another. And I'm just starting to center now. And I think that that's
Mm.
what we should do as Muslims, is to find our center
Yeah,
and not be unwavering, and not allow others to knock us off track or push the pendulum too far. I think that, gosh, I'm trying to think of the word of, and it's not moderate. I hate the word moderate. Um, but center, just finding the center, I think,
mm.
is important.
Yeah,
And and to be happy about your Islam and stop lecturing others. You know, there's this group I call the listers. You can't do this, you can't do that. A bit
Yes.
of this is
Yeah.
around it. And it's such a turn off.
Yeah. Stop trying to make everyone else a perfect Muslim and make yourself a perfect Muslim as much as you can.
You know, I was told, because I was a bit like that, you know, I admit I had the zeal of a convert. It's important that we don't turn people off or turn people away. And I was told very early on, Islam is perfect. The people who practice it aren't.
No.
And we need to accept that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Jazakallah. May Allah guide us and keep us on the right path. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Yvonne, for taking us through such a personal and powerful narrative. We hope that your story inspires us all to be more understanding, empathetic, and less judgmental when dealing with our fellow human beings. We also hope that it inspires others who are non-Muslims to look into Islam with an open mind and learn more about this religion that has inspired so many throughout the generations. To our listeners, thank you for listening. Thank you for your continued support. Please do subscribe to Kianistan if you have not done so already, and like this video and share, which really helps us. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time.